Mind and body are not separate. And I think in the past, our kind of Western medical model is very much made up of, physical stroke, mental. So we tend to see physical illnesses as physical. Whereas, of course, the mind interplays with all illness. And, the stories we tell ourselves about an illness are bound to have an influence on that. We cannot separate mind and body. How we identify with an illness. Do we see ourselves as the illness? Do we use it to describe us? Because once we go down that road, it's a slippery slope to get back off. Yeah. And that's something that's very entrenched within yogic philosophy. What is it we're identifying with, and can we let that go?
There's quite a few influencers that I follow online who suffer from illness, and sometimes it's chronic illness. And their Instagram account is all about their battle with chronic illness. But unfortunately, I think it can be counterproductive, that, because you start to very much identify and get kind of validation for what you're suffering with. Sometimes these people will become famous for their struggles with their illness, and they get a lot of sympathy for it. But it all becomes part of their identity, and their unconscious mind is leading them to staying in that state.
I completely agree with you. And the people I work with, I'm always wary, about, obviously it's up to them, but I think support groups, you've got to be very careful of, because yes, of course, if you're ill and isolated, a support group can be helpful. But then the risk is you take on the identity of that group, and then you can't move on, and you then identify as being a sick person. And then, particularly if you get famous through being sick, there's kind of a reason to not leave that, isn't there? And there's quite a famous healer. I don't know if you've come across Caroline Mace. She wrote a brilliant book called Anatomy of the Spirit. And she uses the word woundology. And what she means by this is that if we resonate with our wounds, and we kind of resonate with other people who've got the same wounds, and that's all we're talking about, we're going to kind of almost vibrate at that frequency. And then it's kind of impossible to move away from that. So I think if we have a chronic illness, these are questions we really need to be asking ourselves. Who are we hanging out with on social media? What are we talking about? Somebody who I really love is Eckhart Tolle. And he says, if you are ill or chronically ill, the only person you should really be discussing your symptoms with is your healthcare provider. And other than that, don't discuss your symptoms, because it's almost like you concretize them. You kind of make it more solid. And when you do that, I think it's a fine line. And certainly when I run retreats, I always suggest that people talk about health and well-being rather than discussing symptoms too much. And I don't mean that unsympathetically.
No.
It's a fine line to tread.
That is very, very interesting. I want to think about not just people with chronic health issues, but all of us. What is something we could do kind of straight away that might take a minute or two that could help us?
To breathe more slowly. So when we're stressed, our autonomic nervous system speeds up the breath to get us out of danger, because that's a stress response. So to bring our parasympathetic nervous system back online, we want to breathe more slowly, and preferably through the nose and from the diaphragm. So I would suggest taking the hands and placing them on the navel and slowing the breath right down to maybe 5 or 6 times a minute. And a way to really bring the parasympathetic nervous system online and to calm the whole system down is to slightly lengthen the exhalation. So breath really holds the key.